is the introduction to Sir Arthur Eddington's 1927 Gifford Lectures, where Eddington famously contrasted the familiar commonplace table, quote, which lies visible to my eyes and tangible to my grasp, with what he called the scientific table, which is nearly all empty space. And the key difference between the commonplace conception of the table and the scientific conception is that the former, at least according to Eddington, is committed to the idea that everyday physical objects are composed of substance, right? Which is kind of entirely fills the physical space it occupies, excluding other matter. And of course the scientific conception denies this, right? It's this kind of scattered cloud of microparticles with lots of empty space in between, right? So here's a quote on the handout. It makes all the difference in the world whether the paper before me is poised, as it were, on a swarm of flies and sustained shuttlecock fashion by a series of tiny blows, or whether it's supported because there's substance below it, it being the nature of substance to occupy space to the exclusion of other substance. Now perhaps, I guess the next most famous statement, at least amongst philosophers, the next most famous statement about the clash between science and common sense, is Wilfrid Sellers' famous distinction between the scientific image and the manifest image. And Sellers explicitly states that his contrast is the same as Eddington's, right? So after this is in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, after discussing the apparent difference between the nature of sensations as we phenomenally conceive them and conceived of as brain events, neural events, Sellers writes, it's worth noticing that we have here a recurrence of the essential features of Eddington's two tables problem. The two tables being, in our terminology, the table of the manifest image and the table of the scientific image. So he was explicit that this is pretty much the same table. Now Sellers was clear when he speaks of two images, what he means are just two conceptions, right? But nevertheless, Sellers thought that the source or the basis for our manifest image conception is our sensory experience, or at least one fundamental and important source is our sensory experience. For Sellers, it's the perceptible qualities of an object that are hard to reconcile with the scientific image of that object as a scattered cloud of microparticles. Likewise, it's the phenomenal nature of conscious mental states that's hard to reconcile with them as neural physical events in the brain. And in fact, in a similar vein, Eddington himself wrote of the process by which external world of physics is transformed into a world of familiar human acquaintance in human consciousness. Now, more recently, John Campbell, in his recent book that he co-authored with Qasim Qassam, he's also written about the apparent conflict between the nature of our sensory experience and the picture of the world that's given to us by physics, by mathematical physics. So again, this is a quote on the handout. He says, mathematical physics gives us a firm conception of matter, but it seemed to show our surroundings to be unlike anything in sensory experience. The trouble is that physics seems to push sensory experience inside the head. If mathematical physics is the whole truth, then the qualitative character of our experience seems to have little to do with the qualitative character of our surroundings. Okay, so I think the common idea here is something like this. The reason why we kind of have a naive folk conception of the physical world as populated by objects composed of substance with kind of smooth, sharply defined edges and surfaces and boundaries and so on, is that our perceptual experience represents the world as being populated by such objects. Right? In other words, the source of our kind of mistaken common sense conception of physical matter is that our experiences are already antecedently committed to this picture. Right? Committed to this. So in this way of thinking, right, the surprising revelations we get from physics about the very most micro-physical nature of the world, it doesn't just contradict our common sense or folk intuitions, right? It also contradicts the very testimony of our senses, the very content of experience itself. Now, of course, once we accept that the spatial properties that are apparently represented in experience are not in fact properties possessed by the physical objects in our surroundings, it becomes very hard to avoid some kind of indirect account of perceptual experience, on which, our spatial phenomenology is at best correlated with, co-varies with the stuff outside which is causing it, but the, structurally isomorphic to is another way of putting it, but the intrinsic spatial phenomenology has no match with what's outside us, right? And indeed, both Eddington and Sellers explicitly endorsed something like structural realism, or you might call it Kantian humility, about the external world. So in his later book, this is 1939 book, Philosophy of Physical Science, Eddington says, what sort of thing is it that I know? The answer is structure. To be precise, structure of the kind defined and investigated in the mathematical theory of groups. And Sellers himself, in Empiricism, Philosophy of Mind, says, the success of living, thinking, and acting in terms of the manifest framework can be accounted for by the scientific framework, which proposes to replace it, by showing there's sufficient structural similarities between manifest objects and scientific objects. Right? So they're both attracted to this kind of structural view. Now, John Campbell's suggestion, in contrast, is that we should accept a kind of what people often call a layered conception of metaphysics, right? So Campbell, again, I hope this is on the handout, says, our understanding of sensory experience will be transformed by giving weight to the idea that reality can be described at many levels. We can acknowledge there's something fundamental about the physics of our surroundings, whilst being pluralist about our world. So the dissonance between the qualitative character of experience and the character of the world described by physics is then an artifact of shifting from one level of description to another. Now, of course, much, much more could and should be said about what the hell a level or a layer of reality is exactly, and, you know, what notion of supervenience or grounding, and blah, blah, blah. And there's a huge amount being written about this at the moment. But fortunately, I can leave all those issues aside, because I'm going to argue against the assumption that's apparently in common to Eddington and Sellers and Campbell, which is that sensory experience provides some kind of, well, that sensory experience is in tension in the first place with the deliverances of physics. At least in the respect that Eddington and Sellers are talking about, the substantial nature of matter. So to be more precise, what I want to deny is that visual experience represents that the environment we see before us conforms to this common sense conception of objects as composed of a homogeneous, gapless substance that excludes all other matter and has sharply defined boundaries. So I'm going to make 2 points, right? And the first of them I think is kind of really fairly uninteresting and obvious, but I'm going to make it anyway. And the second one is maybe more interesting, but I'm much less sure about whether it's correct. So the first point, right? Within the standard kind of representational account of experience, that's kind of something like the orthodoxy these days, I myself, not necessarily a subscriber to that, but it's totally normal to assume that spatial properties are represented only up to a certain degree of determinacy, right? A normal, successful perceptual experience accurately represents that an object has a kind of general, determinable shape and size and location and so on, without representing any perfectly, microscopically specific spatial properties, right? So my experience might represent silver as being about 6 foot tall, without representing that it's exactly 2.0000 or whatever, how many meters you are. It's very tall. Likewise, my visual experience might represent a ball as being more or less smoothly spherical, without representing it as being perfectly, ideally perfectly spherical in volume, right? So just to give one example of a famous representational theorist who's explicitly saying this, again, I hope this is on the handout, Peacock. Chris Peacock has an influential account of scenario content, and he says, in giving the content, we should consider a set of ways of filling out the space, right? And greater acuity corresponds to a restriction on that set of ways of filling out space, all of whose instantiation is consistent with the correctness of the representational content, right? So in other words, there's a whole set of ways that the environment could be, all of which would make your experience veridical. And indeed, it's often claimed that an advantage of a representational account of experience is that by appealing to the indeterminacy of content, you can explain various kinds of phenomenal indeterminacy, right? Blurriness of vision when you remove your glasses is one obvious case. There's also the literature on the speckled hen, right? That's supposed to be another kind of indeterminacy which is accounted for by representational indeterminacy. And in fact, there's even a number of results from from cognitive science that have been interpreted as showing that shifts in your attention can measurably affect the determinacy with which spatial properties are represented. So there's been a lot of work by a woman called Maria Carrasco, which it's been interpreted as saying if you put your cognitive attention on something, the determinacy with which spatial properties are represented is measurably increased. Anyway, so here's a comparison, right? Here's an analogy. Suppose you're looking at a beach, right? A long sandy beach. That's a few miles away, but it's in perfectly plain view. You can see it, it's a clear day and so on. Right? So you see a kind of undifferentiated expanse of a certain shape, it's kind of yellowy in colour. Right? Is there any temptation here to suggest that because you can't make out all of the trillions of individual grains of sand, your experience is therefore some kind of illusion or projection? Right? No, I take it, right, is the intuitive answer here, right? That's just how you expect trillions of grains of sand to look from a goodly distance away. It would be quite implausible to suppose that your experience here positively represents the beach to have a homogeneous, gapless structure, spatial structure, right? And thus should be counted as an illusion. It's much more plausible to suppose your experience is just silent. The content of the experience is just silent about the fine-grained structure of the beach at that kind of distance away. Right? In other words, there's no commitment about the microscopic level of the beach at all. Right? It's just silent about that. So assuming that it does represent something about the spatial qualities, it's only going to be large-scale, determinable, general qualities. Right? So that the human visual system has limits to its resolution, to its acuity, so that the fine detail of an object's spatial outline is never perfectly represented, doesn't mean that we're constantly subjected to a spatial illusion of any kind. Notice also there's very little theoretical attraction, it seems to me, to think that when you see the general shape of the beach from a distance, you're aware of some higher level of reality that's distinct from or over and above the arrangement of all the individual trillion grains of sand. Right? So again, there's no motivation here to go the way Campbell does. Right? I mean, maybe layered metaphysics is great, but there's no obvious motivation here to go that way. So my suggestion then is we needn't be panicked by the kind of spooky, unfamiliar descriptions you get of matter at the quantum level, at this incredibly fine microscopic level, into thinking that our sensory experiences of everyday macroscopic shapes are somehow illusory, right? Just caused by these shadowy noumenal objects, right? Rather, we can simply maintain the swarm of particles that physics tells us composes the table, arranged table-wise, as they call it. It's just precisely what we're getting perceptual experience of. It's just we don't see every individual microparticle, right? There's a limit to the determinants of it. So, I mean, I hesitate to attribute a kind of basic error to giants, right? Luminaries like Eddington and Sellers and so on, but I mean, a potential confusion that's relevant here is mistaking the lack of a representation for a representation of a lack, right? So there's a crucial difference between an experience positively representing that the object has a homogeneous gapless structure, right? Compared to the experience just not saying anything at all about its structure. When we think about the visual phenomenology of seeing a solid table, right, there may be some initial temptations to think that the experience represents that it's perfectly gapless and smooth right down to the smallest scales. But I think reflecting on the example of the distant beach should incline us to the view that the visual phenomenology is just silent, makes no commitment at all about the structure at that level. Okay, so that was the first point, and I think that's kind of not terribly controversial, right? The second point I want to raise, and this is partly just an excuse to retell my favourite kind of well-known philosophy anecdotes. So probably many of you have heard this before, but I'm going to say it anyway. So during some philosophical discussion, a student of Wittgenstein, and some people say it was Anscombe, I don't know, is supposed to have remarked, it doesn't look like the Earth is rotating, right? And the student thought she was stating something kind of obvious and non-controversial. But wily old Wittgenstein, of course, he asks in response, well, how should a rotating Earth look? Right? And of course, his point is that as the Earth does in fact rotate, the way that things look is just the way that a rotating Earth does in fact look, right? To someone stationed on the surface. Right? So in other words, in the Middle Ages, this is on the handout, the following line of thought might have seemed correct. Premise 1, the way the Earth perceptually appears indicates, in other words, provides non-conclusive evidence that the Earth does not rotate. Premise 2, the Copernican theory tells us that the Earth is rotating, right? Conclusion, what perceptual experience tells you about the Earth and what the Copernican theory tells you differ, right? They clash. Now, someone defending the Copernican, rotating Earth theory, they might accept that line of thought. In other words, they might allow that perceptual appearances are misleading, right? The Earth is not, in fact, the way that its appearance in perception suggests. So that would be to concede that appearances do weigh against their theory to some extent, but there's a bunch of other evidence that counterbalances. But Wittgenstein's move in the story is to reject that first premise. Right? The way the Earth appears does not indicate, it doesn't provide any evidence that the Earth does not rotate. Right? It's only a kind of wrong-headed background theory or background conception that would make you think that. Right? So we might sympathise with medieval people erroneously taking the appearance of the Earth to be evidence for the non-rotating theory. But we now realise people in the Middle Ages, they weren't just wrong about whether the Earth rotates, they were also wrong about the evidential bearing of the Earth's appearance on that astronomical question. Right? For they failed to grasp that the way that the Earth and the sky appear just is how a rotating planet ought to appear. You should expect it to appear, given that you're tiny and you're located on its surface. Right? So now compare. Here's a parallel argument. Premise 1 star. The way that the table perceptually appears indicates that the table has certain properties. For example, its matter gaplessly and homogeneously fills the space to the exclusion of other substance. Premise 2 star. Physics tells us that the collection of microparticles which compose the table does not have these properties. They're widely scattered and blah, blah, blah. It's a cloud with vague boundaries. Right? And so the conclusion 3 star, what perceptual experience tells us about the nature of the table and what physics tells us about the nature of the table clash. Right? So I suggest that we could make a parallel move to Wittgenstein's move in the story and reject premise 1 star here. The way the table perceptually appears in experience does not represent or indicate that it's homogeneous and gapless and so on, right down to the microscopic level. That's something we might foolishly infer given a kind of wrong-headed background theory, but the experience itself has no such commitment or evidential bearing. Eddington and Sellers, by assuming that the appearance of the table conflicts with physics, they're making the same kind of error that Wittgenstein's student in the story is making. So again, bearing in mind this analogy with a distant beach, we can ask a question that's kind of parallel to Wittgenstein's and say, how else should you expect a cloud of microparticles arranged table-wise to look, right? To a human observer of our scale and our level of acuity, right? And as the table is in fact nothing above a cloud of particles arranged table-wise, that's just how it looks, right? There's nothing illusory about it. Now, a worry you might have about the kind of moral I've drawn from this Wittgenstein anecdote is that it might threaten to overgeneralize, right, and undermine the very distinction between illusory and non-illusory experiences, right? So let me just kind of give voice to that worry. So consider the famous example of a straight stick in water that in some sense looks bent, right? A parallel move here would be to say, well, how else should you expect a straight stick in water to look, right? We sympathise with people who think that gives evidence that it's bent, but in fact, that's just wrong-headed. Once you realise about the refraction of light is different in water and air, that's just how you should expect a straight stick in water to look, right? Or consider the Muller lyre, right? Again, you could say, well, how else should, equal-length lines with funny arrowheads on the end look to a normal human visual system? That's just how it does look to a normal visual, right? So we begin to lose our grip on the very distinction between illusory and non-illusory appearances here, right? So in other words, if the Wittgenstein move were always legitimate, the physical world could turn out to be any way whatsoever, and our experience, well, that's just how your experience should be, that's how you should expect it to be. Right? So something seems to have gone wrong here, we seem to have kind of overgeneralized. Right? Actually, I think providing a neat definition of when an experience is illusory and when it's not is actually quite difficult, and there's a lot of, it depends on your metaphysics for experience and stuff. But one thing I do want to just briefly finish by sketching why the move in the original Wittgenstein story is good, I think, and making the parallel move for the Muller lyre and for the stick in water is bad, right? And I think the reason we count the Muller lyre or the straight stick in water as optical illusions, right, optical illusions, is that the appearance of the objects in question is not predicted by our kind of intuitive folk understanding of visual appearances, right? And I take this kind of natural folk understanding, naive understanding of appearances, to include a kind of rough and ready implicit grasp of perspective, of the fact that things further away kind of take up less of the visual field, so they look smaller. Things in dim light you can see less detail of and have less bright colours. All of those, right, a 4-year-old child understands implicitly, right? Now, the appearance of the earth and sky is in fact in accord with that simple folk theory of perceptual and visual appearances, right? And that's why Wittgenstein's rejoinder in the story was a good one, right? It was wrong-headed to expect the earth and sky to look any other way, even by the standards of our folk naive understanding of visual appearances, right? Whereas with the stick in water or the Muller lyre, it's not to be expected by the standards of our folk everyday understanding of visual appearances, right? That a straight stick should look bent, or that when you have equal length lines with funny arrowheads on the end, they're going to look different, right? So in these cases, we can specify some other way that we can reasonably expect the straight stick to look. We reasonably expect the straight stick in water to look the same damn way it looks out of water, right? And we reasonably expect equal length lines to look the same way whether or not they have arrowheads on them, right? By the lights of our folk intuitive understanding. Of course, by the lights of our best scientific understanding of human vision, we shouldn't have those expectations, right? But we count the Muller lyre and the straight stick as optical illusions because they flout our intuitive understanding of how objects should look, right? Now, when it comes to the fact that everyday objects are actually composed of a scattered cloud of microparticles, my suggestion is that it is part of our everyday folk conception that you're visually insensitive to very, very fine details, right? So the fact that the table doesn't visually appear to be composed of lots of tiny particles with gaps in between them is to be expected even by the lights of our everyday naive folk understanding of appearances, right? Because our folk theory of appearances includes the idea that from a certain distance you lose any grasp of these kind of fine details of spatial structure. And that was part of the point of the comparison with the distant sandy beach. Okay, so just to conclude, I've argued that any mistaken views we might kind of naively harbour about the substantial, gapless nature of physical matter can't just be read off from the phenomenology of experience, or from the content of experience. Right? However, that leaves open that the nature of our visual experience might clash with physics or with science in all sorts of other ways. Right? I mean, that was just one specific way it doesn't clash. Right? For example, you might think that the non-Euclidean nature of space is in tension with the apparently Euclidean nature of experience. Though in fact a number of philosophers, even going back to Thomas Reid, have claimed that even phenomenology itself isn't Euclidean. But anyway. Or you might think, for example, that the relativity of shape to an observer's frame of reference is somehow intentional with our spatial phenomenology. Right? Or you might think, if string theory tells us there are actually 11 dimensions or 12 dimensions, that's intentional with the apparent three-dimensionality. So there's all sorts of other ways that it might clash with experience. And it's then an interesting question in each of those cases whether something like the Wittgenstein move in the story or whether the appeal to indeterminacy of content will likewise get rid of the appearance of clash. Right? So, maybe our experience represents space as being roughly Euclidean, but not perfectly Euclidean. It represents. So maybe the same kind of moves can be made. Maybe they will, maybe they won't work. But that will have to be a topic for another day. Thank you.
Very clear presentation. So now we have questions.
Sorry, let me just grab a pen.
Silver.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. I have a question. So the way in which I thought I understood the image of the idea of the manifest image,
yes,
is that there is a distinction in conceptual apparatus that we use to talk about reality, and I took that to go sort of together with the layer metaphysics that you were talking about. So I found that your proposal very convincing about the beach and the little pebbles or grains or pieces of the beach. But in that case, we apply the same conceptual apparatus to the beach and to the little pieces of stones, right? So in particular, for instance, we both predicate colors of them. But now, when we go, I find that example disanalogous from the case of the table and the microstructure. So for instance, the table is, brown. In basic physics, things are not brown. They can emit, wavelengths of a certain sort, but they are not brown. So, and you might think about the same with perhaps values or other properties, right? Yes. So,
no. I basically agree with everything. Color is a harder case. I totally agree. And again, depending on your full-blown theory of visual experience, maybe we are subjected to a kind of persistent illusion where experience attributes color to physical matter, and physics tells us that it doesn't have any such properties. So, and you're right. There's much more to the clash between manifest image and scientific image than this one tiny thing about substance that I've identified. Like you say, values. Sellers was, normative things are part of the manifest framework that don't have any obvious, grounding in the scientific framework. So, I hope I didn't give the impression that if we've solved this one tiny clash about substance, all our worries in this area have gone away. Absolutely not. This was just one. But yeah, colour's a very interesting case. It's not obvious to me that. It's not obvious to me that in thinking that something's coloured, we think that it's got colour right down to the smallest scale, right? Or anything like that. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation and talk. I feel myself very sympathetic to the ideas of structural realism and ontic realism. But there is a thing that I couldn't understand. First of all, I'm seeing on the whole problem from the point of view of physicists, being a physicist from the basic education, and reading Niels Bohr papers. I'm wondering why the concept of complementarity disappeared from the discussion, from the general argument. From the point of view of Bohr, it would be a great mistake to say that electron appears to be a particle, but in reality it is a wave, or an atom. It appears as a particle, but in reality it is a superposition of waves. Indeed, we have different descriptions of the same reality, which are complementary to one to another, and to an extent, this descriptions can be incommensurable. They are very different, inconsistent. But the reality may have many aspects which differ from one from other, and the whole set of these descriptions is the reality.
Good. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer everything, but so I mean, one point which you correct totally. I mean, I was talking about a scattered cloud of microparticles, and that's, you know, I'm not a physicist. That's really a load of nonsense, right? I mean, it's not a scatter. It's like a wave function, as you said. And so when I say scattered cloud, that's just my kind of placeholder for stuff I don't understand that physicists tell us, right? You know. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. But I mean, I'm not quite sure I understood. You were saying that you were attracted to the idea that there are multiple, as it were, layers to reality, and that they can be complementary, but you said they can also be inconsistent?
In the sense that the particle isn't a wave. The description of the thing as a particle is not consistent with the description it as a wave.
Right.
So the wave function, we can have it in the space, in the coordinate space, or in momentum space. And these are different descriptions of the same reality, which are not completely consistent.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, I agree with that. What to make of it, though, right? I mean, do we want to say that reality is inconsistent, or do we just want to say that our theory still needs work, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, this is way beyond my non-existent competence in physics to discuss. So, there's one other thing one other thing I wanted to say. I mean, you know, there's many reasons you might want to be a structural realist or even an ontic realist. I mean, Eddington and Sellers seem to be motivated by this idea that there's a clash between, you know, by some kind of indirect model of experience, right? And in fact, I think Russell and Poincaré were also motivated by this same kind of thing, right? But there's many other reasons you might want to be a structural realist, right? I mean, these days, people like John Worrell or other people, I think they're not interested in experience at all, right? Or, you know, the ontic, they're Ladyman and Ross and all these people, they take it all from quantum physics. They don't talk about experience at all. So, I mean, if you're antecedently attracted to the idea of the idea that there's a reality out there about which we can only know this kind of abstract relational thing, well, then you're not going to care at all about a persistent illusion in experience, right? Yeah.
Sorry, this is a clarificatory question. I didn't get this analogy between in the second point, like the move. I didn't get this analogy that makes the move by Wittgenstein possible in the Hertz case, but not in the well-known.
Yeah, good.
You know,
So my claim, good. Yeah. So my claim, and you might disagree with this. My claim is that the way that the Earth and the sky appear is in fact consistent with our kind of folk, naive understanding of how visual appearances work, right? Which includes such things as a kind of implicit grasp of perspective, the idea that things look smaller from a distance away, the idea that a penny at an angle will look elliptical, all this kind of stuff which you implicitly grasp as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, right? I think once you think about the way that the night sky and the Earth look, just think about it for a little bit longer and you realise that, well, actually, it's just how I should expect it to look by the light of that folk theory. Whereas with the Muller-Lyer and the stick in water, those contravene that folk theory, right? It's not part of our folk theory of appearances that a stick should look bent in water, and it's not part of our folk theory that equal length lines suddenly look different lengths when you put arrowheads on the end, right? So that's why we count the stick and the Muller-Lyer as optical illusions, because they flout our folk intuitions, right? That's why it's perfectly reasonable to take the Muller-Lyer, before you know any vision science, it's perfectly reasonable to take the appearance of the Muller-Lyer as evidence that they really are different lengths, right? Whereas I don't think it's reasonable to take the appearance of the Earth, the way it looks, to be evidence in favour of the non-Copernican theory. Because if you just think about it a little bit more, in fact, the way it looks is just how it ought to look, even by your intuitive understanding. You're not convinced then?
No, it's just, I was just thinking that I'm going hurt the sensibility of people who actually know physics again, but the way in which the sky and the stars look to us, in a way, is the same way solar system with epicycles look like. So I mean, I think of Copernicus and the Ptolemaic system as two ways of explaining appearances. So I don't know. It's just that, like, yeah, probably I just agree with you.